This is one of the busiest bodies of water on Earth. At any given moment, thousands of ships cross its surface carrying oil, food, electronics, and raw materials between continents. It looks calm from above, blue, endless, ordinary, but this sea quietly powers the modern world. Subscribe for more deep ocean mysteries grounded in real science and history. This is the South China Sea, stretching across roughly 3.5 million square kilometers in the Western Pacific. It sits between China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. On a map, it appears like any other sea. In reality, it is anything but ordinary. Nearly one-third of global maritime trade flows through these waters each year. Tankers loaded with Middle Eastern oil pass through on their way to Japan, South Korea, and China. Container ships carrying semiconductors, clothing, and machinery follow the same invisible highways across the surface. If this sea were suddenly closed, supply chains across Asia would stall within days. Energy prices would surge. Manufacturing hubs would slow. Global markets would react instantly. The world economy depends on narrow sea lanes that most people never think about. But trade is only part of the story. Beneath the surface lies one of the richest marine ecosystems on the planet. Coral reefs stretch across shallow banks. Fisheries here feed millions of people in Southeast Asia. For generations, coastal communities have relied on these waters to survive. Geographically, the sea is dotted with hundreds of tiny features: reefs, shoals, sandbanks, and scattered islets. Many disappear beneath high tide. Others are little more than rocks protruding from shallow lagoons. Yet these small, barely visible formations carry enormous strategic weight. Because in international law, even a tiny island can generate territorial waters. And territorial waters mean control over fishing rights, shipping routes, and potentially vast energy reserves hidden below the seabed. In a region this valuable, even the smallest patch of land matters. For decades, competing claims overlapped across this sea like lines drawn in sand. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all assert partial control over different sections. But one country's claim stretches far wider than the rest. China marks its claim with what is known as the Nine-Dash Line, a sweeping boundary that encloses nearly 90% of the entire sea. First appearing on maps in the mid-20th century, the line cuts deep into waters also claimed by neighboring nations. At first glance, it is just a series of dashes on a map. But those dashes represent something far more significant: history, sovereignty, resources, and power. And over the past decade, what began as lines on paper has slowly transformed into something far more permanent. China traces its sweeping claim back to maps published in the 1940s, when a U-shaped line first appeared enclosing most of the sea. Decades later, that boundary evolved into the Nine-Dash Line. It stretches hundreds of nautical miles from China's mainland coast. Other countries reject it outright. Vietnam and the Philippines cite international maritime law. Malaysia and Brunei rely on their exclusive economic zones. Taiwan maintains claims similar to Beijing's. On paper, overlapping boundaries form a tangled web across the region. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China's sweeping claim had no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The decision was clear. But enforcement in international waters is far more complicated. Beijing rejected the ruling. Construction and patrols continued, fishing fleets expanded. Coast Guard vessels grew larger and more frequent. Instead of fading, the dispute intensified. The sea did not erupt into open war, but it did become steadily more crowded and tense. The flashpoints often center on scattered island groups like the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, clusters of reefs and rocks spread across vast stretches of water. Individually insignificant, collectively powerful, because control over them extends influence far beyond their shorelines. Yet not every country involved claims those islands. Indonesia, for example, does not seek ownership of the disputed archipelagos. But the southern edge of China's Nine-Dash Line overlaps with Indonesia's exclusive economic zone near the Natuna Islands. Around Natuna, Indonesian patrol ships have intercepted foreign fishing vessels escorted by large Coast Guard cutters. Jakarta insists there is no territorial dispute. But it has reinforced its presence, upgraded military facilities, and conducted exercises to signal resolve. For Indonesia, the issue is not about islands, it is about maritime rights. Under international law, An exclusive economic zone grants control over resources within 200 nautical miles. When overlapping lines appear on maps, even non-claimant nations feel the pressure. Incidents at sea rarely make global headlines. They unfold quietly. Water cannons fired between ships, vessels shadowed for hours, fishing boats detained. These are not dramatic naval battles. They are slow, persistent tests of presence and endurance, and over time, something subtle began to shift. The dispute was no longer confined to legal arguments and patrol routes. Across several remote reefs, massive dredging ships arrived. Sand was pumped, concrete was poured. The map itself was about to change. At first, the changes were difficult to notice. Satellite images showed faint outlines expanding over coral reefs. What had once been submerged at high tide slowly began to hold its shape. Sand dredgers worked day and night, reshaping the sea itself. Within months, shallow reefs in the Spratly Islands grew into artificial platforms large enough to support buildings. Then came runways long enough to handle military aircraft. Harbors followed, carved deep enough for large vessels to dock safely. One reef in particular transformed dramatically. What had once been little more than a speck on nautical charts now featured a 3-kilometer airstrip, radar installations, storage facilities, and reinforced structures. From above, it looked less like a reef and more like a fortress. Across several sites, similar construction unfolded. Concrete replaced coral. Anti-aircraft systems appeared. Radar domes rose above the horizon. These were no longer temporary outposts for fishermen seeking shelter from storms. They were permanent footholds in contested waters. The scale was unprecedented. Over just a few years, thousands of acres of new land emerged from the sea. Entire lagoons were enclosed. Reefs that had supported delicate marine ecosystems were buried under layers of sand and cement. Other claimants responded cautiously. Vietnam expanded its own facilities on certain features. The Philippines raised concerns through diplomatic channels. Malaysia monitored developments. But none matched the speed or scale of the construction reshaping the sea. The United States increased naval patrols, sailing destroyers near the new installations under what it calls freedom of navigation operations. These voyages are meant to challenge excessive maritime claims. They are legal demonstrations, but they also carry unmistakable political weight. Each patrol sends a signal. Each construction project sends another. And between them, the South China Sea grows more militarized by the year. Not through open confrontation, but through steady, incremental steps that rarely trigger a single decisive moment. To outside observers, the islands may appear isolated and remote, but placed on a map, they form a strategic arc. From these outposts, aircraft can extend surveillance coverage. Ships can refuel and resupply. Presence becomes persistent. And once presence becomes permanent, influence follows. What began as overlapping claims on paper has turned into physical control runways, ports, radar, and patrols. The sea has not changed color, but its balance of power has undeniably shifted. Beneath the waters of the South China Sea lies another layer of importance. Geological surveys suggest significant reserves of oil and natural gas may rest under the seabed. Exact figures remain debated, but even conservative estimates point to substantial untapped energy potential. For rapidly growing economies, energy security is more than a commercial issue. It is strategic. Domestic production reduces reliance on distant suppliers and vulnerable shipping routes. In a region dependent on imported fuel, offshore reserves represent leverage and long-term stability. The sea is also one of the world's most productive fishing grounds. Tuna, mackerel, and countless other species migrate through these waters. Millions of livelihoods across Southeast Asia depend on daily catches pulled from contested zones. But fish stocks are declining. Overfishing, environmental damage, and aggressive patrols have intensified competition. Fishing boats are increasingly accompanied by Coast Guard vessels. What once were civilian encounters now carry the shadow of state authority. Control of the sea is not only about what lies beneath it. It is also about who controls the lanes that cross it. The South China Sea connects to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. Every year, trillions of dollars in goods pass through these narrow passages. Oil tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, each depends on safe transit. If access were restricted or disrupted, the shock would ripple through global supply chains almost immediately. In modern geopolitics, power often flows along trade routes. Influence is measured not just in territory, but in access. A nation that can monitor, regulate, or restrict key sea lanes holds significant strategic advantage without firing a single shot. Yet the risk extends beyond commerce. Military vessels traverse these waters regularly. Surveillance aircraft patrol above. Submarines move silently below. The concentration of assets increases the chance that miscalculation, not intention, could spark a wider crisis. And still, the sea remains deceptively calm. Cargo ships continue their journeys. Fishermen cast their nets. Artificial islands stand firm against the waves. The transformation has not been explosive, it has been gradual, layered, and deliberate. The South China Sea is no longer just a regional dispute. It is a crossroads of trade, energy, security, and ambition. Beneath its surface, a quiet contest for influence continues, and how it unfolds may shape far more than the waters it contains.